This video contains graphic descriptions of violence and disturbing content related to real-life events, which may not be suitable for all audiences. Viewer discretion is advised.
Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive. And today we're exploring something I think we all find fascinating: missing persons, but with a bit of a twist.
What twist?
Yeah, we're going to be focusing on cases with surprising endings. The ones that maybe didn't end tragically, but instead took these really unexpected turns.
You know, these cases really make you rethink why people disappear and what could possibly become of them. Like you think you have an idea and then you realize, wow, human behavior is a lot more complicated than I thought.
Yeah, exactly. Sometimes truth is stranger than fiction, right?
Definitely.
So we'll hear stories about people who created entirely new identities for themselves. We'll see the struggles they have with their families, and sometimes even cases of straight-up deception.
You know what I find really interesting is how all these cases touch on bigger ideas. Like, what does it even mean to have an identity? What kind of pressure does society put on us? And then what choices do we make when things get rough?
Absolutely. And those are all questions we'll be asking as we go through these stories. So let's start with these new identities. The people who vanished and then reappeared, living totally different lives. It's like hitting reset on your entire existence. And one case that really shows this is Julian Hernandez. He was only 5 years old when his dad took him from his home in Alabama.
Yeah, parental abductions. It's a tough topic, and it happens way more than we'd like to think. And it leaves scars on everyone involved.
Yeah, for sure. So Julian lived with his father in Cleveland for 13 years. He had no clue about his real identity. But then when he was applying for college, a really sharp school counselor noticed his name was on a missing persons list.
It's wild how something as normal as applying to college can untangle a secret that's been hidden for a decade.
I know, right? It really makes you think about how even the most ordinary things can have huge consequences. And Julian's case brings up the whole idea of forgiveness and how people can come back together after something like this happened. Because in the end, Julian did forgive his dad, which tells you there's a lot going on emotionally there.
Yeah, it really does. And it makes you think about how many other people might be out there living new lives without anyone knowing. Like, how many Julians are there?
That's a chilling thought for sure. Now, Julian's story had kind of a happy ending, but the story of Dennis Rarick takes us in a totally different direction. So this brilliant mathematician just disappears in 1976. The only thing he left behind was a weird note about a one-way trip.
Yeah, in cases like that where there's not much to go on and it seems like the person wanted to vanish, it's natural to think the worst.
Yeah.
You know, you have to assume they're gone. It's a way for families and the police to get some kind of closure.
Yeah.
Even if it's a painful one.
Yeah, exactly. And for years, everyone thought Dennis was gone, but then 14 years later, he just pops up living as Leonard Cohen. He had a PhD in computer science and a whole family he'd never mentioned before. It's like he stepped into a whole new life and erased his old one. What could possibly make someone do something that drastic?
That's the big question, isn't it?
Yeah.
Was he trying to escape something specific,
Mm-hmm.
like a problem or maybe a mental health thing, or was it something else entirely? The human mind is fascinating and unpredictable. Some people really need a fresh start. They want to leave their past behind and become someone new. Others might be running from trouble, legal problems, money problems, or even a broken heart. We don't really know what drove Dennis, but his story shows how much people want to reinvent themselves and escape.
It really makes you wonder what's going on inside someone's head when they decide to change their life. Like, the Dennis disappearing and reappearing was a shock to everyone who knew him, but sometimes these missing persons show up in even weirder ways. Like what happened with Michelle Whitaker. She vanished from her home in South Carolina in 2002, and her family was terrified.
Yeah, when someone just disappears without a word, it's natural to get suspicious. The silence and the sudden change in routine are really unsettling for the people they leave behind. They start imagining all sorts of scenarios, usually involving something bad happening.
Absolutely. So it seemed like Michelle's case would stay a mystery. But then there was this stroke of luck. 6 years after she vanished, someone was watching forensic files about a completely different case, and they saw Michelle's picture. It turned out she'd been living a new life in Oregon this whole time. Can you imagine how shocked and relieved her family must have been?
It's a great example of how the media and public awareness can actually help solve missing persons cases. Sometimes the smallest detail, like seeing a face on TV, can set off a chain of events that leads to a resolution.
It's crazy to think that just watching a TV show could end years of worry and pain for a family.
You know, it's a powerful reminder that sometimes, even when it seems like all hope is lost, there's still a chance for things to turn out okay. But as we dig deeper into these stories, we'll see that not every ending is so clear-cut. You know, the whole idea of family can be tricky. Sometimes it leads to people getting back together and making peace, but other times it just pushes them further apart.
Yeah, it's amazing how much someone being gone can affect the people they leave behind. Some people are obsessed with finding out what happened. They spend their whole lives trying to solve the mystery, while others are stuck with all this grief and anger they can't seem to move on. The case of Lucy Ann Johnson really shows how strong family ties can be. She disappeared from her home in British Columbia in 1961, and it left everyone with so many unanswered questions.
What's interesting about Lucy Ann's case is that her husband waited 4 years before telling the police that she was missing. That's a big red flag for investigators right away.
Yeah.
It makes you think that something strange was going on. Maybe something bad happened or there were problems in the family.
Yeah, it definitely makes you wonder what was really going on. But in Lucy Ann's case, it seems like she was running from a dangerous situation. Her daughter Linda never gave up hope, and in 2013, she decided to investigate herself. She actually tracked her mother down all the way to Yukon. Turns out Lucy Ann had escaped an abusive marriage and built a whole new life. She got remarried and even had more kids. It's a crazy story about how strong people can be and how powerful the bond between a mother and daughter is.
Getting back together after being apart for so long must be intense. There's joy and relief and a sense of closure, but it's also tough. You have to deal with the lost time and all the changes that happen to both of you. It shows how people can heal and adapt even after going through something really awful.
For sure. Now, while Lucy Ann's story had a happy ending, the case of Brenda Heiss shows us that family reunions aren't always filled with sunshine and roses. Brenda was a single mom in Pennsylvania who was really struggling. She was going through a divorce, money was tight, and raising her kids on her own felt impossible. Then one day she just vanished, leaving her kids and her ex-husband completely lost.
When a parent suddenly disappears, it can be incredibly traumatic for the kids. It leaves them feeling abandoned and confused. They don't know what happened to their parent, and they're left to deal with all these emotions without any explanation.
Exactly. Brenda's family thought she was dead. They mourned her and tried to move on. Her ex-husband even got suspicious looks from people in their community. He had to raise the kids alone and deal with the stigma of his wife's disappearance. Then, 11 years later, out of nowhere, Brenda turns up in Florida. And get this, she'd been living on the streets and even got arrested a few times. It's such a strange and sad story, and it makes you think about all the personal struggles people go through, the pressure society puts on them, and the choices we make when it feels like there's no way out.
Brenda's actions might seem impossible to understand, but she was probably dealing with a lot of things all at once. Maybe a mental health crisis or addiction, or maybe she just felt completely overwhelmed. Her disappearance might have been her way of escaping her problems, but it ended up creating new ones.
It's a good reminder that running away doesn't always make things better. Sometimes it just makes things worse. And while Brenda's case shows how complicated family reunions can be after someone's been gone for a long time, the story of Petra Petsitka takes us into the world of people who choose to cut ties with their families. This German woman pulled off a disappearance that sounds like something out of a movie.
What's really interesting about Petra's case is that someone falsely confessed to murdering her. It adds a whole other layer of complexity to her disappearance. False confessions are rare, but they do happen, and they can have a huge impact on investigations. Sometimes they even lead to innocent people being convicted.
So in 1984, Petra was a computer science student. She told her family she was going to visit them after going to the dentist, but she never showed up. The police started investigating, and a few years later, a young man confessed to killing her. Seemed like an open and shut case, right? Not so fast.
The human mind is capable of amazing things, both good and bad. When people are under a lot of pressure, they might confess to crimes they didn't commit, maybe to protect someone else or to stop being interrogated, or maybe they just break down mentally.
So then in 2015, Petra is found alive and well living in Dusseldorf. It turns out she decided to cut all ties with her family and live off the grid for over 30 years. She managed to get work and a place to live without any official documents, which shows how resourceful she was and how determined she was to stay hidden.
It's incredible that she lived under the radar for so long, especially with how connected the world is today. Her case makes you think about how our identification systems can fail, how hard it is for law enforcement to find missing people, and how far people will go to stay anonymous.
And the craziest part is that she refused to have any contact with her family even after all those years. It's a really striking example of how someone can choose to wipe out their past and cut off everyone they were close to.
Petra's decision to disappear and stay away from her family shows how much damage that can do both to the person who leaves and the people they leave behind. It makes you think about what family really means, how much the past can weigh on us, and how hard it is to forgive and move on.
Petra's story really shows us that there's always more to these disappearances than we think. But sometimes these missing person cases get even more complicated. They cross over into this world of lies. And the reasons behind those lies can be just as fascinating as the disappearances themselves.
What's really interesting here is how these cases make you question what's real and what's fake. It forces us to look closely at why people would go through all this trouble to create these elaborate stories. What makes someone build these intricate webs of lies, and what happens to them and the people around them because of it?
Yeah, exactly. It's like a whole different level of mystery. So take Kenneth Rodman, for example. He was an American tourist visiting Australia in 2010, and then, poof, he vanished.
Poof.
Yeah, his kayak was found flipped over, so everyone thought he'd drowned, maybe even become a crocodile snack.
Oh, man. That's a scary thought.
I know, right? Super creepy. So everyone just assumed that was the end of Kenneth Rodman, but then 5 years later, he's caught by the police. Turns out he'd faked his own death so he could stay in Australia illegally. Wild, right?
Totally wild.
So was he running from something back in the U.S., or did he just love Australia so much that he came up with this crazy plan to stay there? Who knows?
Yeah, it's hard to say what was going on in his head. But his case definitely shows how far people will go to get what they want. Whether it's escaping a tough past or chasing a new life in a different country, it makes you think about the nature of truth and the consequences of lying. And it also shows how powerful the desire for a fresh start can be.
Definitely. And speaking of motives, the case of Eric Myers is another one that really gets you thinking. So he was a successful real estate agent in Arizona, and in 1991, he disappeared during a business trip. His family thought he was dead. They went through all the grieving, collected life insurance, and tried to rebuild their lives without him.
Yeah, it's tough when you have to assume someone is dead. It's a legal thing, but it also gives families some closure. They can finally start to move on. But then you have cases like Eric's, where the person everyone thought was dead comes back. And that creates a whole new set of problems. Everyone has to face the past again and deal with the emotional and practical mess that comes with it.
It's like a bomb going off in their lives. So 16 years after he vanished, Eric starts sending these weird emails to his family, and finally he reveals that he's alive and well. The craziest part is that he left to embrace his true sexuality, something he felt he couldn't do before. Now, it's great that he found himself, but the way he did it definitely had a huge impact on his family.
It's a good example of how society can pressure people to hide who they really are, especially when it comes to something like sexual orientation. Eric probably felt like he had to disappear to be himself. And his return shows how important it is to accept and support people for who they are.
It makes you think about how many other people are out there living double lives, hiding their true selves because they're afraid of what others will think. And while Eric's decision to be true to himself is admirable, it also caused a lot of pain. His family had to deal with the shock of him coming back after they'd already mourned him. Plus, there were legal and financial issues because of the life insurance they'd received.
It's a tough situation.
Yeah.
It shows that even when we're trying to do the right thing, our actions can have consequences that we never intended. And sometimes those consequences can create a lot of problems for everyone involved.
Absolutely.
Now, let's move on to Winston Bright. He was husband and father of 3 who pulled a disappearing act in 1990. He just vanished from New York City, leaving his family completely bewildered. Years went by. He was declared legally dead, and his family got his pension benefits. Winston's case is interesting because it brings up the idea of fugue amnesia. It's a rare condition where people lose their memories and their sense of self. They might even travel to new places and take on new identities. It's a real medical condition. But it can be hard to tell if someone is actually suffering from it or if they're just pretending to be sick for personal gain.
And that's where things get really interesting, because 20 years later, Winston reappears claiming he had amnesia the whole time. But his memory conveniently came back right when he was about to get his retirement money. So is this a genuine medical mystery, or was something fishy going on?
Yeah, the timing of his memory recovery definitely raises some red flags. It's possible that he really did have amnesia, but also possible that he was faking it to get money.
And his family wasn't buying it. They thought he was more interested in the money than in reconnecting with his kids. It's a story that really makes you question human nature and how hard it can be to tell what's true and what's a lie.
Yeah, for sure. The human mind is capable of amazing things, both good and bad. These cases remind us that the truth can be slippery, and sometimes we're left with more questions than answers.
And for our final case, let's talk about Christina Davison. She was a waitress in Texas who seemed to vanish without a trace in 2014. She left behind signs of a struggle and blood on her bed. And because she had an abusive ex-partner, everyone thought the worst had happened.
Yeah, finding evidence of a possible fight would definitely make investigators think that something bad had happened. In those situations, the priority is to make sure the missing person is safe.
Right. So 9 months later, Christina is found safe and sound. She's working as a waitress in Kentucky like nothing ever happened. She said she was trying to escape her past, but her sudden reappearance left everyone with more questions than answers. What was she running from? Why didn't she contact her family? Was she really in danger, or was this some elaborate plan to get away from something else?
Christina's case shows how important it is to thoroughly investigate these situations and to consider all the possibilities, even when the missing person turns up alive. Her motives are still unclear, and that leaves a lot of mystery surrounding her disappearance.
It's a reminder that even when things seem to end happily, the truth can be much more complicated than we initially thought.
These cases really challenge our understanding of identity, family, and the decisions we make when things get tough. They show us that life is full of surprises, and even in the most confusing situations, there's always more to the story than we see at first glance.
Well, folks, we've explored these missing person cases that took some crazy turns. We've heard stories about people reinventing themselves, people deceiving others, and the powerful bonds of family. But throughout all of this, one thing is crystal clear. The human spirit is incredibly strong and capable of both amazing resilience and shocking deception. So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with a question. What would you do if you could disappear and start a brand new life? What would you leave behind, and what would you hope to find?
It's a question that makes us think about our own lives, our values, and the choices we make when things get hard. It reminds us that even when we face tough times, we have the power to adapt and change in ways we never thought possible.